However, the mainstream narrative of reducing carbohydrate intake to prevent insulin resistance does not actually appear to be consistent with the mechanism of insulin resistance. And it appears that the overconsumption of dietary fat, especially dietary saturated fat, is the most likely nutrient to induce insulin resistance.
In that video, I spoke that dietary saturated fat appears to be the most detrimental for insulin sensitivity. And I got a few questions to explain more why dietary saturated fat appears to be so detrimental. As mentioned in that video, the main underlying mechanism of insulin resistance includes the accumulation of lipid metabolites inside of the cells that should be responding to insulin. This disrupts the insulin receptor and induces that cell to become what we would refer to as insulin resistant. Lipid metabolites, as the name implies, are metabolites made out of lipids. And it appears that of all lipids, saturated fat has the most detrimental acute impact on the accumulation of these lipids, the main one being diacylglycerols, or DAGs. The most likely reason is because it appears that humans preferentially burn polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats before they burn saturated fats. And we also oxidize glucose prior to fats in many situations. Therefore, saturated fats are typically the last macronutrient the body will turn into energy. Therefore, they are more likely to remain inside the bloodstream or inside of our cells. And when uptaken inside the cells, rather than being turned into energy, they are preferentially stored, which increases the likelihood some of them will be turned into these diacylglycerols, which disrupt insulin signaling. And it appears the longer the saturated fat, the more likely it is to be stored rather than burned. We also see that comparing saturated fat to unsaturated fat, or even fructose, saturated fat increases the content of fat within the liver more than all other macronutrients, as well as once again increasing the amount of these lipid metabolites, in this case ceramides, inside of the liver, both of which increase insulin resistance inside of that organ. Another mechanism is it appears that saturated fats reduce adiponectin levels, a hormone that when released actually increases insulin sensitivity. Therefore, this is a secondary mechanism by which saturated fats can decrease insulin sensitivity, by decreasing this insulin sensitizing molecule that is actually directly produced by the fat cells. Next, we see that saturated fats appear to increase inflammation directly at the fat cell, by increasing the production of these inflammatory cytokines, which, as mentioned in that video, essentially have the same effect as lipid metabolites, in which they disrupt the insulin receptor and induce insulin resistance. Saturated fats also appear to disrupt the gut microbiome, such that the amount of inflammation within the gut and the amount of intestinal permeability is increased. This increases what is referred to as endotoxemia, which is when gram-negative bacteria, also known as endotoxins, can get from the gut microbiome into the bloodstream, which in and of itself can also induce insulin resistance, specifically at the fat cell. In no way am I saying that saturated fat is going to make you insulin resistant, but I get a lot of pushback on my videos stating that saturated fat appears to be the most detrimental macronutrient when it comes to maintaining adequate insulin sensitivity. Therefore, I thought it was very important to make a video dedicated to specifically explaining each mechanism by which this occurs, providing the evidence that saturated fat is more detrimental than both glucose and unsaturated fats when it comes to each of these individual mechanisms.